Over a century ago, a mysterious disappearance shook the British military in India. Captain Walcott, once a respected officer in British India, vanished without a trace, leaving behind whispers of scandal and betrayal. Decades later, the shocking truth of his fate comes to light in a harrowing tale of survival, danger, and endurance. Join Colonel Fitzwilliam Thomas Pollock as he recounts the spine-tingling adventures of his fearless friend, Walcott, in Buried Alive by a Dead Elephant.
Whilst with my regiment in Secunderabad towards the end of the 40s, I became very chummy with Walcott, a lieutenant in one of the native regiments. Everybody liked him. He was a good sportsman and had the reputation of being the very soul of honour. His regiment left en route for Jalna, and shortly after it was reported that Walcott had disappeared, and that there were large defalcations and financial discrepancies in the mess accounts, of which he had been secretary for some years. So high was his reputation for probity that the mess president, his own commandant, had passed the accounts time after time without going into them. On the march, Major Wilder and Walcott had a quarrel about getting ordinary fresh stores, and Walcott was removed from being secretary and directed to give over charge of the mess to another officer, which he readily and cheerfully agreed to do in a few days. Walcott had acted on impulse and was rather sorry the next day that he agreed to remove himself as secretary and so meant to reinstate himself shortly. His consternation may be imagined when, on the regiment resuming its march, the adjutant reported that Walcott was missing. There were no telegraphs in India in those days, and although every search was made Walcott's whereabouts, he was never discovered. But on the mess accounts being scrutinised, a deficiency of over 4,000 rupees was discovered, and which Major Wilder had to make good. At long intervals, there were rumours that Walcott had escaped to Bombay in native disguise, that he was a trooper in the Cape Mounted Rifles, and finally that he had met with his death by an elephant. So universal a favourite was Walcott that nearly everybody but his commandant was rather glad that he had gotten away, especially when some years afterwards we heard that the sum deficient had been repaid. He was some 5 or 6 years senior to me and was very kind to me when I was a rookie griffin. Walcott was never in want of money, and Bunselow, the saukar or moneylender, would cash a cheque for him to any amount. His friends would have found the money for him at any time. Why, therefore, should he be a defaulter for a paltry 4,000 rupees and become a dishonoured wanderer? For upwards of 40 years, I never heard anything more of him, and, indeed, had almost forgotten all about him. A few years ago, I was residing in a seaport town in the north of France, and during the season, accompanied by my son, a lad of 10, used to go to a village about 10 miles off to fish. Occasionally, I saw an invalid being wheeled about in a bath chair, and somebody told me he was an Englishman believed to be a retired officer who lived in a cottage near our fishing place, that he was a great invalid and associated with no one. Poor fellow. I could sympathise with him, for we knew scarcely anybody, and a new acquaintance would be a godsend. I called on him but was not admitted. I left my card, but as no notice was taken of my visit, I did not repeat it. One day, my son was alone and had caught a couple of fine trout, and coming across the invalid, accosted him and asked him to accept one, which he did, adding, "I saw him sometime afterward, but beyond taking off my hat, no meeting took place between us." I could not help thinking that his face appeared familiar to me, but I could not catch his name. The French villagers distorted it beyond recognition. Nor could I think where I had known or seen him. I heard nothing more till one day I got a letter from a notary requesting me to attend the funeral of Captain Walcott, who had died a day or two ago at the village of Bellefontaine. Walcott, Walcott, I kept repeating. It can't be the Walcott I knew in India, who disappeared suddenly. It was no use speculating. A day or two would remove all doubts. I attended the funeral and asked the notary why I had been sent for. He said and produced a parcel, which he gave me. I lost no time in returning home and reading its contents. Its writer was indeed my old friend Walcott, and this is the story he related.
I did not like to receive you, Pollock, as I did not know whether you would care to renew our old friendship. The poor have few friends, the dishonoured none, and I am both. My sad history is this. I never was in want of money, for I had an interest in a large manufactory, which my father left to me, and I was entitled to several hundreds a year as income, which, however, fluctuated. The money always arrived late. My drafts, which were never refused, always anticipated it. I intended to take furlough as soon as it was due. I drew only a portion of my income, leaving, as I believed, ample funds for home expenses. I was very unlucky in the Mole Alley races, the year I disappeared, and lost over 4,000 rupees. Do you remember this underground race that takes places in a system of tunnels, like an obstacle course where men crawl and sprint through them like moles? I gave Bunsilo an order for the amount, which he paid over to me at once. He had often cashed cheques for me before, and they had always been met. But this was returned endorsed. Refer to draw. I was astounded. There ought to have been, at least, a couple of £1,000 due to me. Bunselo behaved very shabbily and declared that unless I paid him the amount, with interest, within 3 days, he would report me to the Commander-in-Chief. I had a hundi tent for 3,000 rupees, which I was just going to remit to Madras on account of our mess. But there was no hurry for the payment, and in a weak moment I gave it to him, together with the balance in cash, thinking I could easily replace it in 3 months, and as the mess accounts had only just been audited, I never doubted I should be able to remit the amount to the agents in Madras before the next inspection. I wrote home very strongly and directed that the whole of the amount due to me then was to be remitted to Arbuthnot and Company, bankers in Madras, and that in future all sums that were mine should also be remitted there when due. 2 months and a half passed. I expected the letter in reply to mine at Jalna. We were on the march when that unfortunate quarrel took place, and I was removed and directed to hand the mess accounts over to Graham. I could not obtain the money where we were, and in a day or two I should be a dishonoured man under arrest, and the result must be exposure, dismissal from the service, and most probably imprisonment. This prospect was more than I could bear. About a mile off our camp was an Arab dealer returning to Bombay with some horses. He was an old acquaintance, and we had had dealings together. I went to him and tried to induce him to advance me the money, but he said he was not a saukar. I told him I should be disgraced if I did not get it within 24 hours. Still he would not or could not help me. Then said I, "Will you help me to escape to Bombay?" He agreed to do so if I would pay him down 500 rupees and hand him over my 3 Arab horses. It was a hard bargain, but I saw no other way of getting out of the difficulties I was in. I had some 300 rupees of my own, and I took 200 more from the mess monies. I dressed up as a native, for I could talk Hindustani like one, and during the night I went off quietly, riding one horse and leading the others without anyone being the wiser. Within a couple of hours of my departure, my steeds from being Ray had become bay, chestnut, and black, and I their syce or groom. In the hubbub attending the discovery of my absence, no one thought of visiting the Arab dealer, barely a mile away, but search was made for me far, far away. The Arab dealer remained where he was for a couple of days, and then leisurely marched by the regular stages to Bombay. I remained 2 months in his stables, and then he told me he had sold a couple of Arab stallions for stud purposes for the Cape, and that I could go with them if I wished. I accepted, of course, and no one suspected that Abdullah the Syce was the Walcott so well known throughout the Madras presidency. After I had duly delivered over my steeds, I discarded my disguise and enlisted in the Cape Mounted Rifles. I remained with them for 5 years. I then obtained my discharge and returned to England. I found the business that my father had established so firmly in a tottering state, and that no more money had been remitted to India on my account. However, I got sufficient from my partners to repay Wilder, and with the balance, some £500, I returned to the Cape. I had made the acquaintance of Gordon Cumming, the famous hunter, And at one time, it was in contemplation that we should conjointly make another trip into the interior of Africa. But Cumming changed his mind, preferring to remain at home with his exhibition. But he gave me many useful hints, and, purchasing all I required, I set up as a professional hunter. I bought 2 wagons and 2 teams of bullocks and 5 good horses, went inland and traded and hunted for 10 years. I was very lucky, and by the sale of ivory, hides, horns and curios, I made sufficient money to buy myself an annuity which would suffice to keep me in comparative affluence for the remainder of my life. But the devil tempted me to make one more trip before leaving Africa and settling in Western Australia, as I had determined to do. I was luckier than usual. I had my wagons full, and I was returning when the fly appeared, and my cattle and horses died off one by one. Forming a camp near water and leaving my wagons and men there, I, with a bearer, set out to try and reach a missionary station some 60 miles off, and there get a span of cattle to remove my goods, which were worth fully £1,000. We had a dreary trudge, for people do not walk as a rule in South Africa, and we subsisted on what we shot. We had completed 40 out of the 60 miles, and I hoped in another 24 hours to be at our destination. The country was hilly, cut up with ravines, and most unexpectedly, we came upon a herd of elephants. It would have been well if I had left them alone, but I was covetous of the ivories carried by several of the bulls and killed 3 and wounded a 4th. This one would not die. I fired some dozen bullets into him, but he seemed to bear a charmed life. We lost sight of him amongst the kopjes, and in tracking him, he suddenly charged down upon us. I escaped by throwing myself behind some scrub, but my gun carrier stood in his path and fired both barrels of my weapon into his head. Before the smoke cleared away, my poor attendant was a shapeless mass of clay. I now thought only of the death of the monster and of avenging my follower, but he led me a long chase. At last, from the top of an eminence, I saw him standing near some rocks, evidently waiting for me. I took the bearings, and by walking around some outlying hillocks, I hoped to creep up near enough to administer a coup de grace. I got to the place I wanted to all right. I was between 2 rocks, and close by was a deep trench, about 7 feet broad, which I could easily jump, but which would stop any living elephant. I was thinking of advancing, when the monster evidently got the wind of me and charged headlong. I let him come within 6 or 8 feet, and then let him have the contents of both barrels, and sprang backwards, intending to clear the trench. But my foot slipped, and I fell headlong into it, and in a moment I was in total darkness. I was a good deal shaken, and on recovering my feet, I found I was in a living grave. The walls were scarped granite, and the aperture above was closed by the huge body of the elephant, who filled it completely. I lit a match to examine my position more carefully. There was a lot of debris at the bottom of the trench and an inner cave, raised above the outer portion about 2 feet. For a wonder, there was also a small trickling stream which flowed along on one side, disappearing in a fissure at the extremity. I collected the decayed debris and formed out of them several torches. To escape seemed impossible. To move that mass of flesh above would take the strength of a team of cattle. I alone could not have moved an inch. At last, pressed by hunger, with my shikar knife, I cut out a piece of the flesh above me and broiled it in the embers of a fire I lit out of the debris. But the smoke nearly blinded and choked me, and the stench sickened me. The meat was so tough and nauseous that I could not swallow it. At last, I heard lions roaring, and a report above convinced me that the body, extended with gas, had burst. Now, all the quadrupeds and bipeds could devour it. But would they do so in time to save my life? I feared not, for hunger and want of fresh air were slowly, but surely, killing me. Driven to desperation by hunger, I stepped out of my cave into the trench, intending to cut out a portion of the now putrid flesh. When I felt a shower falling on me and lighting one of the few matches left, I discovered to my horror that not only was the floor several inches deep covered with maggots, but that they were raining down on me. I staggered back towards the cave, and their consciousness left me. When I regained my senses, I found myself in bed attended by the missionary and his wife, and it was many days before he would relate how I came to be under his care. For, alas, I soon discovered that I was bereft of both my legs from the knee down. Then I had a relapse and lay between life and death for fully 3 months. I can never sufficiently express my gratitude to Mr. Marks and his wife for all the kindness they showed me and the care they took of me. When I was sufficiently well to be carried into the veranda, he told me some wandering bushmen, attracted by the chattering of the vultures, visited the spot. They heard groans, and on dragging away the skeleton of the Leviathan to extract the tusks, they saw my legs hanging down from. They lifted me from my living grave and carried me to the missionary station, where it was found necessary to amputate both my legs, for they had been riddled through and through by hundreds of maggots, and doubtless in a day or two mortification would have set in. I had been imprisoned 8 days, and it was a marvel I had not died. It was useless my going to Australia in my crippled state. I had a widowed sister living in the north of France, and after realizing the money by the sale of my last venture, for the missionaries sent for my wagons when I was able to indicate where they were and where they were found. But no traces of the Hottentots who had been with me were ever discovered, and whether they got back to civilization or died on the way, I never knew. They had deserted the wagons. I left the Cape, purchased a further annuity, joined my sister, and have lived ever since where I am now. She died some years ago, and my life has been indeed dreary since.
And thus ends the letter handed to me where portions have been omitted, having reference to purely private affairs of others. I have no doubt in my mind that the writer was my former friend, Walcott, who so mysteriously disappeared in 1850.